So again, my name is John Torpy. I'm director of the Ralph Bunche Institute here at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. For those who may not be familiar with this institution, it is essentially the PhD granting part of the far-flung CUNY system, which includes all these colleges that you've heard about forever: Hunter College, City College, College of Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, et cetera. And they decided 60 or so years ago, when they created this amalgamated system, not to replicate PhD programs at each of those campuses. That just didn't seem to make a lot of sense in terms of the numbers. So it was all concentrated in one place that for a long time was on 42nd Street, essentially overlooking Bryant Park, which is not a bad location. But this one I think is much better. This building used to be the beat for old timers. This is the old B. Altman department store. And it's here for the same reason that Macy's is 2 blocks down the street, which is that it's accessible from all kinds of public transportation. And it's a great place to come to work. It's very convenient for those of us who have to commute. So, and the Ralph Bunche Institute, for a long time was oriented basically to UN affairs, as befits, our namesake, who was Undersecretary General of the UN, and of course a Nobel Peace Prize winner in the early days after World War II, basically. But we've sort of expanded out to more general kind of international topics, and this is obviously the sort of thing that we're very eager to put on an event about. So I was thrilled when Klaus and his team approached us about doing a talk here at the Graduate Center. And I want to just briefly introduce him. He's served as Secretary General of the European Parliament for like 13 years, key administrative post in the EU system, from which he is in fact stepping down, I understand, in the fairly near future. His previous roles in Brussels included serving as Chief of Staff to the President of the European Parliament, as Director General for EU internal policies in the Parliament's administrations, and as Secretary General of the center-right European People's Party. And he's now a visiting professor in European politics at Université Catholique de Louvain. My Dutch is bad, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it in Dutch, but it's in Belgium. Hence it has 2 different names, of course, like everything in Belgium. He visited Kiev in late September on the invitation of the Verkhovna Rada, which I don't know what that is, so you can tell us, in order to identify how the European Parliament administration can best help Ukraine's parliament in the preparation for EU's accession. So we have a number of co-sponsors: the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, as you've already heard, the DAAD Alumni Association of the United States. Thank you, Helena. The CUNY Academy for the Humanities and Sciences, and of course the Ralph Bunche Institute. So with that, I want to invite Klaus to make his remarks on Ukraine, Europe, and the return of geopolitics. And I look forward to a spirited discussion after he's done. Thank you so much for coming. Yes. Sit here. Yes. Keep an eye on you. Okay.
Good. Thank you very much, first, for still being here. The excuse we have is that simply we were with Dr. Kissinger, and at a certain moment the conversation picked up, and therefore it would not have been, so we had to choose between 2 ways of being impolite. You, of course, can accuse us of having chosen that way of being impolite, but that's the situation. So I will try my very best to, let's say, to nevertheless, hopefully have a good performance here, and so that you still have enjoyed your day. So I have to speak about Russia, Ukraine, European Union, and geopolitics. And I've been doing this at several universities in the last days, because this is really the dominating issue right now. And I believe this will be a defining issue for decades to come, dependent on the outcome. So I think it's very useful that we take the time here. I think it is very important to develop a clear view what this conflict is all about. Conflict in Ukraine, war in Ukraine. There have been wars in other places. So what's so special about this one? Yes. I'm a bit too tall.
Can you carry it? Hold it?
Yeah, I can hold it. Yes. So what's so special? What's so special about this? What makes a difference? And also, why is this all happening? You find a lot of people, including the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, who is basically saying, he's not saying Putin has gone mad, but he's saying, look, it's very strange. Probably he had a very bad COVID time. He was isolated. He didn't have a lot of contact. So that might explain. I know him better from the past, so I cannot explain this. And we know also that the former president of this country at the time had a deep look into his eyes and had found a soul. So that soul must have disappeared somehow over the last years. I don't know. But I've learned in my university education, which admittedly is some time ago, that madness should not be the explanation of first resort. At least not if you are in a scientific environment. Madness should always be only the explanation of last resort if you don't find any other reason. So the question is, do we really have to resort to madness of a leader and personify the issue, or can we also find rationality, even though this is probably not our rationality? Can we find a rationality on the Russian side? And how could we reconstruct a rationality on the other side? Is this really so special or so extraordinary or not? And I just would like to go through, when I made my collection, I came to up to 10 points because I've been educated to always come to 10 points. If I only come to 9 points, I've failed. If I come to 11 points, I've exaggerated. I can't swear that now I'll come to 10 points, but I've identified already 10 points. So let's start with something easy. If we look at Russian history over the last 500 years, people who know better than me have calculated that Russia on average has expanded every year by 50 square kilometers. 50 square kilometers is not very much, but if you do this for 500 years, quite a territory which is coming together. So in fact, this is something which, if you put yourself into the continuity of Russian history, is something which is not extraordinary, it's not exceptional, it's something which happened. Russia has expanded from Moscow to the east, to the south, and to the west. Secondly, if we have a look at Vladimir Putin himself, we see that from the very beginning of taking office, he has not shied away from military means. He started the war in Chechnya. In fact, it was kind of his election campaign. You know, he presented himself as the tough man Russians could rely on, and he would be able to sort the situation. He would be able to sort the situation out. So also when we look at the person of Vladimir Putin, not only Chechnya, Syria, Georgia, in a different way, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Syria, of course, he has been using military means on a very regular basis. So also from his personal track record, it's nothing which is completely outside the norm, but rather in the continuity, with one exception, that everything he did up to now was very well calculated. It was normally relatively short term with limited means. It wasn't of that size. That can be admitted. Thirdly, we can also say that Russia is still perceiving itself as an empire. So what do empires do? That's what empires do. Inside the European Union, we also have a very nice collection of empires. who used to do this very similar thing. You know, we are thinking of the French, if we are thinking of the British, but even the smaller ones, the Danes were an empire, the Swedes were an empire, the Portuguese were an empire, the Spanish were an empire. The Italians, you know, we have to go very far back in history, but, you know, they tried with Ethiopia and with Libya. They were an empire. The Germans tried to be an empire. I had recently some success. I had to speak 2 weeks ago at the European Bishops' Conference, and the chair is a bishop from Luxembourg. And I said, yeah, and even Luxembourg was an empire after Charlemagne, you know, it's some time ago. And he liked that idea. So in fact, I'm just making this point to say, nowadays it seems strange that somebody wants to be an empire, but this is our own past as well. We could also phrase it in the concepts of Timothy Snyder, who has described this war as a colonial war. We had the privilege to discuss with him 2 days ago. He basically is also of the conviction that the Second World War, when it comes to the German engagement in the East, was conducted as a colonial war. And when we remember how the local population was treated, in fact, there are very good arguments to believe that the war, not in the West, but the war in the East was treated as a colonial war. So we could also see this as a kind of colonial war. And if it's true that already 1 million people have been abducted into Russia, that children have been given free for adoption, that the corn is basically being stolen and sold, that now probably in Kherson already the medical equipment is taken out. This is something which is not just a normal war exercise. This is what you do if you treat another area of land as basically a colony. One could also say this is an act against a potential competitor. What is striking is that Ukraine, I think in 2011, 2012, discovered major reserves of gas in the Black Sea, very close to Crimea, but also major reserves of gas in the Donetsk area, in a quantity that is very close to the gas reserves of Norway. And Norway is a major country for gas reserves. So these reserves are huge. If we also know that Ukraine is a country that has, yes, only 0.5% of the surface of the earth, but 4.8% of the raw materials in the earth, then this could maybe also be understood as an attempt to take a competitor out. Because Russia nowadays has to get the gas from northern Siberia for Europe, which is extremely expensive to get out. If the alternative is somebody who can offer it from the Black Sea or from the Donetsk area, that is quite a competition. Another argument is Ukraine and Russia, we know, are historically very close. So if Ukraine could demonstrate that it can be a viable democracy, market economy, functioning legal state, be successful, integrate in the West, which argument would be left for the Russian leadership to explain to the Russian people that this is not possible in Russia? Very, very few. It's of course not the same, but it's maybe a bit similar also to China and Taiwan in the sense that Taiwan is demonstrating that you can have a functioning economy, a functioning democracy on the basis of a cultural history which is Chinese, which is a challenge to the Chinese system in the mainland. So these are already a lot of arguments, not that I share them, but from a Russian perspective, which at least do not force us to say somebody must have gone mad. But when we listen to Putin's declaration he gave 3 days before the war, or to the article he wrote in the summer before, we find other ones. We find, for example, the argument that Ukraine isn't a country. Ukraine doesn't exist. Ukrainians are not a people. Ukrainians are just small Russians, or in short, Russians. And so how did they come to this strange idea to be a separate people or a separate country? That's interesting to listen to him. He's saying because Lenin was naive, he conceded in the end of the 1910s and beginning of the 1920s, the creation of a Ukrainian republic. And worse than that, he accepted that they had a real say over their affairs. So Lenin was incredibly naive, which is not how we remember Lenin most of the time. He said Stalin did it a little bit better because, yes, he made the mistake to continue a Ukrainian Soviet Republic, which is the source of all problems, because then they had the right to leave afterwards, but at least they had nothing to say under Stalin. Okay, Stalin we normally also do not perceive as incredibly naive. So he's saying, okay, they got it wrong, I get it right. Ukraine will cease to exist, and of course they will have nothing to say, and the Ukrainian people doesn't exist. But I think it's useful to think about in which historical order he puts himself. Lenin, Stalin, Putin, and the most radical solution is being proposed by Putin. So that shows us that this is not just a conflict about an area somewhere in the east, or about Crimea, or about the land bridge. It's fundamentally putting into question the right of Ukraine to exist and of Ukrainians to exist as a people. He's also belonging to those who are arguing that the unilateral world has to be finished. Unilateral world means the United States dominating and so on. He's arguing in favor of a bipolar world. Okay, why not bipolar? No, why not bipolar? But we have to remember one thing. The key argument is coming in the tradition of Dugin, philosopher, let's say, in hyphen from Russia, but which he obviously shares, is that whereas the decadent West is putting the individual person, human rights, rule of law first, what really deserves to be put first is the bigger entity. And the bigger entity in the case of Russia is the eternal Russian people, closely linked to China. In the case of China, we could say the Communist Party of China. The problem is that historically, when we are looking back, whenever the bigger entity was given more importance than the person, normally we are very close to violence. Was the case of Nazi Germany, where race was much more important than the individual, but also the case of the Soviet Union. If the bigger entity is the important thing, then the individual in doubt can be sacrificed. So that's why I think we have to understand bipolar in the full sense, not just as two geographical poles, but also two philosophical concepts which have serious consequences then on what are the chances for the individual to live a decent life and to have its basic rights respected. So if we so easily find so many arguments, and we could find more, why do we then believe that Putin must have gone mad? Probably because, at least in the European Union, we are now living in peace for more than 70 years. And for us, it's kind of natural, has become kind of natural that war among us is nothing that can even be considered. So we confuse the world and the rules of the game inside of the Union with what is happening outside of the European Union. Or somebody else has put it in the phrase that maybe we are, I think the right expression is herbivores, and others are outside rather carnivores. We are also accustomed to American leadership, and that the Americans will sort things out. But that is exactly what is put to the test. And it's not something that is the natural order of things. It is how the world has been functioning after 1945, but there's no iron guarantee that it will always be the case in all cases and for all time. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin tries to challenge. It's also true that we collectively have given signs of weakness, which maybe then were taken as a kind of encouragement. If you allow me to start with the weaknesses in this country, and then I come to the weaknesses in the European Union. The weakness list in the European Union is longer, so I take you first. To have, let's say, the period of Donald Trump was probably perceived by some as an invitation, because we know his preference for strongman personalities. Just in the last days, he has said that Xi Jinping is smart. Don't know whether he's smart, but we know that he has now assured him a certain mandate and taken out the checks and balances in the Communist Party. He had a similar admiration for Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and so on. And also got along, I think, quite well with Vladimir Putin. And especially the storm of the capital, I think, could have been perceived as, from the outside, as an extreme sign of weakness over here. We've gone through the experience of Afghanistan, where finally we didn't maintain. I don't want to judge whether it was right or wrong to leave, but it was perceived as a weakness and a defeat. But earlier on already, we had Syria. The president of this country, at the time, Barack Obama, declared that if there ever were to be a chemical attack, that was the red line, and that would then trigger strong American reaction, if not to say intervention. Chemicals were used, and the intervention didn't take place. So now the American audience is sufficiently depressed. Now I have to depress the European audience. Brexit is, of course, perceived as a sign of division and weakness, because the British Army is a very, very important, let's say, component of European security. Debt problems in several member states probably didn't help. The rise of parties, pro-Russian, or parties on the very right, probably was also perceived as a weakness in the system. Maybe even the departure of Angela Merkel, who maybe, I don't know whether he liked her, but surely he respected her. So maybe people also came to the conclusion that this is the moment, because we have shown a lot of sign of weakness and therefore would probably not be able to react, which capacity then came as a major surprise. So where does all of this put us? And given that today we also have to speak about geopolitics, according to the title, I have now to use some kind of geopolitical concepts as well. So geopolitics always starts with a map. You have to look at the map. You have to situate ourselves on the map. So if we situate ourselves on the map of Europe, Europeans have a look at Europe, then I would say we have two principles, and two principles only, which are nowadays structuring the European space. We have the union of citizens and states in the West and in the center, which is the European Union. Not everybody is a member, but even those who are not a member have been forced to have contractual relationship with that union. Even Britain, Switzerland, to name just maybe some of the very, very important ones. And in the East, we still have the principle of the 19th century, which is empire around Russia. What is the difference? If you're in a union of citizens and states, it's based on free will decision. You can join. Sometimes it's very tough to join, takes a long time. But you also have the right to leave, as we have seen with Britain. Britain, unfortunately, from my point of view, but Britain has left. Wasn't an easy process, but it's absolutely possible. It's not a jail. And the participants are on a position of legally equals. If you are running an empire, the situation is very different, because basically you are inviting your neighbors to submit yourself to them. It's not a relationship of equals, but it's a relationship of dominance. And because that's not a very attractive proposition to submit yourself to your bigger neighbor, you're also very close to violence, because only through violence you can then integrate at the end of the day resisting countries and people into your space. We see that the space that still exists between the two is shrinking and is potentially the area of war. That's Ukraine, that's Georgia, which already was the object of aggression, and that's Moldova. So that's the map I have when I look at Europe. From an American point of view, America sees a different map. When America looks over, America doesn't see Europe, but America sees Eurasia, at least in the geopolitical tradition. So I'm a fan of Nicholas Spikeman, who wrote two important books in 1943 and in 1945. And in this tradition, you could say that America is interested in three things. First, nobody else should control the Atlantic. That's assured since the Royal Navy had a bad time. Nobody should control the Pacific except the United States. That was the outcome of the Second World War against the Japanese. And no single power should control Eurasia. Whenever a single power threatened to control Eurasia, and that happened with Nazi Germany in cooperation with Japan, but that also happened with the Soviet Union, where the most Western countries were not able to defend themselves, America was there and avoided that a single power could take over control of Eurasia. If we look at the situation nowadays, there's only one who can challenge the United States in that position. In the Pacific, it's China. It's a very strong investment into the construction of its own navy. And in Eurasia, it's China. It's China in its immediate environment, but also with the Road and Belt Initiative, building up its marine, building up like Djibouti points where it can, let's say, get support, but also, it's always useful to check whether what we are saying is right into these days with assuring itself 25% of the Hamburg harbor. So it's trying to establish a network all across the Eurasian continent. So from an American point of view, looking at the map, you see first China challenging the American position in the Pacific and in Eurasia. But of course, we also have to admit Russia aggressing its neighbors. So if we take these two things together, Russia challenging the security order as established after 1991 in the western side of Eurasia, and China challenging the established order in the Pacific and in its immediate neighborhood. If we are speaking about the first island chain and then the different island chains, that means that security concerns where we believe they had disappeared after 1991 are absolutely back. The outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was that we believe the time of system competition is over. I was still politically socialized in the 80s. I'm a veteran by now. So I'm from, before that time. I'm from the time of system opposition. Germany was divided. I was engaged in the youth. We tried to, bring information over, and then we had German unification and so on. But since 1991, the paradigm was system competition is over. And there's one thing that counts, and that's price. So you will produce wherever, whatever system, doesn't matter anymore, as long as you can get the lowest price where you're producing this. And very often that was China. In the new security situation, where the challenge is both on the Western part, Russia towards the security order in Europe, and China in the Pacific and on Eurasia altogether, we are seeing that the leading paradigm is moving away from price towards security. We can see this again in practical examples. First is Huawei as network provider. We decided against Huawei in the United States and in most of the European countries, even though Huawei had the better product and the cheaper price. And we took Nokia and Ericsson, which had a product which was technically less advanced and more expensive. So that means we gave preference to security over price. That means if you give preference for security over price, we are going into inflation, because you pay more than you would normally have to pay, We could take a step further. Just last week, the President of the United States decided that the highest level semiconductors from the United States can no longer be delivered to China. But not only that, that also others, if they use American components in their products, are not allowed to deliver the highest semiconductors anymore to China. And if I've understood this correctly, Americans which are cooperating with Chinese companies as lead managers or as scientists are threatened to lose the citizenship of the United States. Is that far-reaching? I would say it's very far-reaching. So we see that we are shifting away from 30 years where the key thing was global exchange, globalization, lowest price, doesn't matter what system, into a new paradigm where the key thing is security. And that leads to inflation because you pay higher. We had 30 years of a deflationary effect because hundreds of millions of Chinese workers came onto the market and delivered everything cheap. We are now re-inflating the system, which of course will also have repercussions into our own system. So how did the European Union manage the Ukraine issue? Brilliantly? I would say brilliantly. So why do I say brilliantly? A, reaction time, financial crisis, years. Reaction time, COVID, 6 weeks. Reaction time, Ukraine, 2 days. So what did the European Union do? A, sanctions packages, 8, to a degree which never ever had been adopted. Not against Iran, not against Venezuela, against nobody. Second, the acceptance of millions of refugees in a couple of weeks. I think, if I know the figure right, but it's fluctuating because some are going back, 7 million refugees from Ukraine in a couple of weeks. Under preferential conditions, which means they were allowed to work right away. Financial contribution, strongest from the United States. Right afterwards, European Union institution, nearly 20 billion euros. Number 3, Britain. Number 4, Germany. Germany is a bit counterintuitive because Germany has done everything to create the impression that it doesn't want to do anything, but it's the fourth biggest donor. By the way, United States and Britain high up, is there logic? Yes, because United States and Britain are guarantor countries of the Budapest Memorandum from, I think, 1994, when Ukraine said, okay, if I give up my nuclear weapons, who is guaranteeing my security? Up came United States, Britain, and Russia. So we know how Russia has been dealing with the issue, but that the United States is engaged and Britain is engaged, I think has to be normal as a direct consequence of the security guarantees they gave in the Budapest Memorandum. Customs-free access to the European Union market, within 2 weeks linked to the EU energy grid between Ukraine and the European Union, and maybe most important, hope by giving candidate status to Ukraine. Hope is maybe not a very tangible good, but what can you do if you have no hope? Not very much. So that was a decision which was very, very important for Ukraine. So what do we have to do to prepare better for this changing world? In the European Union, definitely a lot has to happen on defense, not only on procurement, I mean on buying new weapons, but to give you an example, the United States has 30 plus major weapon systems. The countries of the European Union altogether have more than 170 different weapon systems. What is the consequence? You pay everything far too expensive. You're wasting a lot of money. So we have a completely divided market in armament products, and we have a completely divided demand structure because member states want to do it all on their own. That means we are paying far too much. So a lot could be done by reforming the internal market on armament products, where for the moment, every member state can say for security reasons, I'm opting out. There we are not even discussing sovereignty or European army. We are just discussing avoiding waste. So that's something very important to happen. We also have the European Peace Facility. Ukraine has received, paid by the European Union, weapons from the member states in worth of more than 3 billion. So the European Union is moving into territory where it has never been. Unimaginable 2-3-4 years ago. What the European Union has been doing, receiving refugees, access to energy market, providing direct financial support. All of these could not have been done by NATO. Sanctions packages have not been passed by NATO. Sanctions packages are decisions of the European Union. That means we are now in a time of weaponization of everything, where energy is used as a weapon, where refugees are used as a weapon. We remember that refugees were brought by airplane to the Belarusian border to destabilize Poland. And in times of weaponization of everything, NATO alone does no longer have the complete toolkit. So NATO and European Union are becoming complementary and national and partners, complementary partners in times of weaponization of everything. We also have to work on strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. You can give whatever name you want. What is it? From my point of view, it's the capacity of the European Union to be able to react to external shocks. A war is an external shock. Are we prepared to deal with the consequences, yes or no? An interruption of trade flows could be an external shock. Let's assume China would really become aggressive on Taiwan. What would be the consequences globally? Are we able to provide ourselves with raw material? Are we able to have access to high technology, or aren't we able? So the system is adapted to this with the CHIPS Act, with a special focus on batteries and so on. So the European Union has to spell out exactly what does strategic sovereignty means in the sense of being able to react to external shocks. But the United States will also have to adapt, and that is especially the case for China. I've already mentioned that the highest level chips can no longer be delivered to China. And let's not forget that globally, more than 95% of the most sophisticated chips are produced in Taiwan. And Ukraine? Why is Ukraine doing what Ukraine is doing? I had a talk at London School of Economics, and a student asked me, yeah, but why don't they just make peace and stop the suffering? The answer is because it would not be the end of the suffering. The Ukrainians are decided after their historical experience in the 30s, where more than 3 million died because agricultural products were taken away and sold or exported to somewhere else, to no longer be a colony. Neither a Russian colony nor a German colony, as it was a German project during the Second World War. They are decided to no longer be a colony. They want to be a sovereign state deciding about their own future now because of the historical experience they have made. We could also understand this if we are thinking more in political terms as the nation states continuing to move east. 19th century, establishing of the German and Italian nation state, so-called late nation states. 20th century, establishing of nation states in the corridor east of Germany from the remnants of the Austro-Habsburg Empire. 21st century, establishment of a Ukrainian nation state. But from the very first moment, linked to Europe and linked to European integration. We should never forget that Ukrainians were risking their lives to have an association agreement with the European Union. Can you imagine that? I could never have imagined that people risk their lives in order to have an association agreement with the European Union, which sounds terribly technical. But it simply meant they wanted to be part of that pole on the European continent, the part of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So Ukraine has taken that decision, and that's why they will continue to fight. Unfortunately, when we look back in history, we are looking back to nearly 100 years of, Hannah Arendt would have said, totalitarian challenge, from Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union to nowadays. Unfortunately, that challenge is not over, and we will again have to defend our freedom. Thank you very much. We change roles.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to take the questions that come in online, but so, yeah. So thank you so much for that survey of the causes of this conflict and of some of the consequences of what's been happening. Maybe I should do this too. So thank you very much for doing that. And I mean, there's plenty of ground here, I think, for us to explore further. And I hope you're willing to take a few questions, and want to open it to the room and to those online who hopefully can hear me out there. And hopefully I can figure out